Well, since it's my birthday, I feel it's obligated to me to tell the story of my origins, which is somewhat unusual. So I was born in New Zealand, in Oamaru, in the South Island, which a lot of people have not heard of except for Russ. Yay! But I was supposed to be born in Africa. And that's because my parents, my mom was a British nurse who worked at the mining hospital in what was then called Northern Rhodesia. And it was about 12 kilometers away from the border of Congo. And as mom would say, and the Congo was breaking out at the time. And it was the era of independence in Africa from British and other European colonial powers. And she met a rather rough, hard-drinking guy, and he was from Kurau, New Zealand, which Kurau's claim to fame is the tiniest little town in the South Island. And the claim to fame of Kurau is that it's the home of Richie McCaw, who was the captain of the All Blacks. And as a matter of fact, my grandfather worked for the McCaws. They were big farmers, sheep farmers around the Kurau area. And Malcolm McCaw, Richie, I think, was a grandson or a grandnephew of the McCaws anyway, were a big deal in the Kurau area. And Richie went on to be the captain of the All Blacks. Anyway, Mom, Dorothy, met Bill, and my father was a foreman at the copper mine. Northern Rhodesia, the north part of Northern Rhodesia is called the Copper Belt Province. And there was a massive copper mine, which is still there. And I went there a few years ago just to see the place that my parents had talked about so much. It's called Mufalira, and that was the town. And there, the mine is still there, cranking out the copper. And Dad worked there along with a lot of South Africans, white South Africans, and Canadians, and various other people from around the Commonwealth the British owned mine there. And Mom worked at the mine hospital. It was the British hospital. So that's where I was conceived and almost born. And then Dad decided the last minute he wanted his first child to be born in the place where he was born. And so we were whisked off. Mom was whisked off to the South Island of New Zealand, and I entered the world in Oamaru on a winter's day, which people always say, you're a summer baby. No, actually I was a winter baby on June 24th. And that's the origin of my story. 2 weeks later, I always thought we lived for several months there in Oamaru, but we didn't. When it finally, just a few years ago, I looked at Mom's passport from that. She still had her own passport. And I saw that we left New Zealand and we went to Fiji, where Dad got a job at a gold mine in Fiji, which also is still operating there on the main island of Fiji, 2 weeks after I was born. So I was off. That was my first international trip, and I've been traveling pretty much ever since. And so did my family. So we lived in Fiji, then we went to Sweden. Dad got a job for a Swedish multinational company. We lived in England, back where my mother was from for a while. Then we went to Lagos, Nigeria. We lived in there for a while in Africa. And then finally ended up back in Lower Hutt, New Zealand. And that's where my first memories are of growing up in New Zealand and going to Waiwatu Primary School, learning to read and write. I remember the whole gale. There was a big hurricane that came through New Zealand at that time that people still talk about, in the ship. I forget the name of the ship, but it was sunk in the Wellington Harbour, Waini, in the Wellington Harbour. And I remember that day we were off from school and the whole house was leaking. I was running around. I was just a toddler, a little bit older than a toddler, 4 or 5 years old, with bowls to basins to catch the leaks of all the house that was of our house that was leaking. Shortly after, a few years after, we went to Sydney, And that was another experience of living in Australia. We thought we were done there, and then finally, when I was a teenager, we moved to New Jersey. Big change. First saw snow. Yeah. And first saw snow. We had to buy, anoraks and gloves and hats and coats and the whole thing. And that's been that's a partial of my story of how I grew up.
That was Christina. Origin stories. I felt like you were going to tell us like how you're unbreakable or something, or who your nemesis was, but yeah. All right, well, that's our list of storytellers, unless anybody's feeling super inspired and wants to get up here and take the microphone from me. Mark loves the spotlight as much as I do.